Here's a recap of overhead absorption. So let's suppose we're making something, and in our factory we're going to be using some materials. So those materials and the costs relating to those materials will be directly linked with our production. So we'll take a certain number of kilograms and add that to our unit. And also we're going to have some labour time, and that's another direct cost, because when the labour is physically working with that unit, then we can add the cost of that labour to that unit. There may also be some machine time, and this may be a variable overhead. So it could be that the unit is going to be inside the machine for half an hour, so we'll take half an hour of the cost of that machine and include that in the cost of that unit as well. So this is going to be variable because it may spend half an hour in the machine, it may spend 45 minutes in the machine. So what we're going to do is take these direct costs and include them in our cost card. So we've got some cost for the materials, some cost for the labour, and some cost for the variable overheads. But what about the other overheads? What about the rent for the factory? Now we're focusing here on the production costs. If this was rent for the offices, then that's going to be a pure overhead. We don't care about that at the moment. But in terms of valuing that inventory, the rent for the factory is a production cost, and we need to include some of that rent in the value of our inventory. And this is a requirement of International Accounting Standard number 2. So we've got our cost of the rent. Let's suppose it's this amount, and somehow we need to include this rent cost in the cost of our unit. But we've got to work out how we're going to do that. Well, let's suppose that we're going to be making 10 units during the year. And so what we could do is just divide the cost of the rent into 10, and we'll just take 1/10 of the cost of the rent and include that in the cost of our inventory. So each unit will have 1/10 of the rent as part of its overall cost. And then that will give us what the total production cost for that unit is. So that's the basic idea of absorption costing. We're taking the total cost of the overhead and absorbing it into each unit. Now there is a formula for doing this, so our overhead absorption rate will be the budgeted overhead, so that's the budgeted rent and the budgeted heat and the budgeted light, and we will divide by the budgeted activity level. So in this case we are thinking we are going to make 10 units during the year, so we just simply divided by 10 and we took 1/10 of the rent and included that in the cost of one unit. But it may be a little bit more complicated than that. So again, let's take our overall rent, but we recognize now that in our factory there are 3 distinct areas. So there is some space in the factory for manufacturing, there's some space in the factory for packaging, and there's some space in the factory for maintenance. So what we're going to do is, before we start absorbing any of this cost into the units, we're going to share the rent between 3 different areas. So we could do that, if I think about rent, we could do that for, say, square meters. That might be an appropriate way to share the costs between the 3 areas. So most of the factory is devoted to manufacturing. There's quite a big size for packaging, and the maintenance area is quite small. So we're just going to divide up the rent in proportion to the square meters that each area takes up. So what we could do now is that we could allocate the rent to those 3 areas. But we need to recognize that these 3 areas do different things. So 2 of them, for manufacturing and packaging, those are production departments. And we know that those 10 units that we were making will spend some time in the manufacturing department and some time in the packaging department. Whereas those 10 units will not spend any time at all in maintenance. Now, maintenance takes up some of the factory space, but maintenance doesn't directly work on those 10 units. So what the maintenance department does, in an example of a support department, they will support the production departments. So we need to treat the rent cost a little bit differently for that maintenance department. So what we can do though, we can see that some of the rent is clearly linked with manufacturing and some of the rent is clearly linked with packaging. So we can take some of that cost and simply allocate it and apportion it to those two departments. But what about maintenance? It's difficult to attach the maintenance to one of our products because the product never visits the maintenance department. But what does the maintenance department do? They maintain some of the equipment in the production departments. They maintain the machines in manufacturing, they maintain the machines in packaging. So what we're going to do is that we're going to work out how much time does the maintenance department spend in each of the two departments, and we're going to reapportion the rent cost that we've already allocated to maintenance, and we're going to reapportion that to the existing production departments. So now that we have a rent cost allocated to manufacturing and a rent cost allocated to packaging, we can now absorb these into the 10 units that we made. Now remember, we've got that formula. The overhead absorption rate is the budgeted overhead divided by the budgeted activity level. So the budgeted overhead is the number that we've just calculated based on the apportionment of square meters and then the time that maintenance spends on each of those two departments. Okay, so we've got two different budgeted overheads now, one for each of the two production departments. Now let's just spend a little time thinking a bit more about the activity level. So we're going to divide by a number, and so far we've simply divided by 10 because we're going to be making 10 units. So yes, we could do that. That's a perfectly valid way of doing it. So yes, we would divide by the number of units we plan to make. So every time we make one unit, we'll include some cost for rent. But if we do that, then we are going to have the same amount of overhead per unit. And in some cases that's perfectly acceptable, but sometimes that's not going to be logical. Let's suppose that we have different types of production. Perhaps we have different products. And it could be that one product takes half an hour to make in the machine, but another product may take only 10 minutes to make in the machine. So would it be appropriate to include the same amount of rent expense for both of these when one of them takes 3 times as long to be made as the other? So it might be more appropriate then to try and divide by machine hours, and we use machine hours as the basis for working out our overhead absorption. So in this case, the overhead absorbed will be in proportion to the time spent in the machine. So if one product takes 30 minutes to make and one product takes 10 minutes to make, then we will include 3 times as much rent cost in the first product than we would in the second product. Similarly, it could be that we have a product that doesn't have any time in the machine at all, but it could be labour intensive. So in this case, our activity would be based on labour, and we would absorb based on the amount of time that the labour spends working on the product. So if our people spend 20 minutes working on one product and let's say an hour working on another product, then they would spend different amounts of time, and so we'd include different amounts of rent. There'd be 3 times as much rent expense in the product that takes an hour to make. So when we're thinking about our formula, so again, here it is again, the overhead absorption rate is the budgeted overhead divided by the budgeted activity level. So we might divide by the 10 units, or we might divide by 1,000 machine hours, or we might divide by, say, 500 labour hours, whatever is the budget for the period of time we're looking at. And then when our product is in the machine for an hour, we would allocate 1 hour's worth of rent expense into that product, or whatever amount of time that the product is in the machine, or the amount of time that the product is being handled by our labour.